All right, thank you, Oyvind. We will move on to our next presentation now, and we have Dr. Ragnar Tetris, who's professor and vice dean of research at the University of Stavanger Business School in Stavanger, Norway. So, Ragnar, we look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. It's really a great pleasure to be able to join you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, and I can see your screen.
And you see my screen. Okay, so now my next challenge is to be able to move my presentation, and I'm able to do that. Okay, so just a brief presentation of myself. I'm at the University of Stavanger Business School. I've been working on aquaculture and seafood markets for the last 20 years or so. I collaborate extensively with companies and organizations in the industry. I've also headed a government-appointed green paper commission on the seafood industry. And currently, I'm head of an industry committee consisting of CEOs in leading companies that will propose a framework for aquaculture regulation towards 2030. And in the middle of November, I'm going to deliver a report on a roadmap for offshore aquaculture to the Minister of Fisheries in conjunction with a conference. So it's a special sector. If you look at the profitability margins in salmon aquaculture in Norway, although they're volatile, they have on average been high, much higher than you see in other sectors, and typically would have led to entry of new production capacity. And that has happened to some extent, but it's been fairly limited the last years. And that can be explained by two things. And now I'm talking both about Norway and other producer countries, such as the US. It's the first is that the producer countries do not give sufficient license to grow. And that could be because of real biological challenges. It could also be because of perceived biological challenges and other environmental effects or external effects. And I think we have a more friendly regime in Norway towards the industry than what we have seen in the US over the last 20 years. Much resources and knowledge is devoted to aquaculture regulation in Norway, and I'm going to focus on regulation. But still, I would argue that the Norwegian government regulation is struggling to keep up with the new opportunities and challenges that we see that are created by technological innovations and new diseases and so on, because there's a lot happening, as suggested by these pictures here, in terms of closed onshore, closed and semi-closed sea-based, and in offshore farming. Basically, salmon aquaculture growth is restricted by environmental emissions and biosecurity concerns, and that is mainly related to sea lice, salmon diseases, escapees, and organic emissions. So this is a way to illustrate it. The externalities we have in salmon farming, escapees, diseases and sea lice and feast weight, etc. And these externalities, they basically provide a rationale for government regulation. And these externalities, they are both within the salmon industry, between farms, so diseases and sea lice, and to other sectors such as wild fisheries, wild salmonids, and so on. And if we take a snapshot, this is from last week, I guess. This is what it looks like in terms of sea lice and diseases, where we had 44 farms that were above the sea lice limit set by the government, which is 0.5 female sea lice per salmon in most of the years and 0.2 in the weeks where the wild salmon migrates out in the ocean. 462 farms were below that limit, so they didn't violate it. There were 94 farms with PD and 33 suspected, and then there were 8 farms with ISA. And actually, if you're curious about the development, this Barnes Watch site actually is available for everybody, so you can go and get the snapshot and development over time for sea lice and diseases. Okay, so what has this development we have seen over the last years meant for the cost productivity in Norwegian salmon farming? And this figure shows the production cost in NOK per kilo, and $1 is equal to approximately 9 Norwegian kroner. So to make it easy, you can take off the zeros here on the vertical axis. And then you have the total production in Norway in metric tons. So what I've done here is that I've sorted all the companies according to production cost, average production cost. So on the left hand side, we have the most efficient ones, and then on the right hand side, we see the least cost efficient. And this is the picture we saw in 2005. And then in 2010, I'm losing some of the PowerPoint here because of let me see if I can reduce, minimize. No, I'm not able. Yeah, there we are. Okay. So this is the development in 2010, and what we see then is that the production capacity increased from 2005, but the most efficient farms were not able to keep production costs down at 2005 levels. And then, oh, now I've got stuck here. Let me see. Yeah. Then in 2014, we see a further increase in production towards 1.3 million tons. In 2015, we see just a slight increase, and we see that costs have shifted further upwards. In 2016, we see even further increase in production costs and no increase in production. And then in 2017, which is the last data year here, we see that the production costs are approximately the same as before. And I think that this is the cost picture that we see today too. And what is the explanation for this? In this period, there's been more technical innovations in disease treatment and so on. I think much of the explanation here is these externalities with sea lice and all the treatments that are driving up costs and mortality and so on. And also that the high world market prices are giving incentives to producing towards capacity, also driving up costs. So sustainable growth in salmon aquaculture depends on innovation, and there are several opportunities now. As I've indicated before, you have the conventional open cage systems where it's possible to have a number of innovations. Still, you have the closed land-based production that we also see emerging in the US for salmon. We have offshore production, and we have closed or semi-closed sea-based production. And just to give you an illustration of what kind of challenges these innovations can mitigate, let me show you this figure of the relationship between the biomass of farmed salmon in a region and disease pressure. So what happens as you increase the total biomass in a region is that the disease pressure increases, at least after some threshold level, and increases more rapidly for a given technology level. And the problem with that is that it affects productivity negatively. So you don't get so much out of your biomass quota when volumes increase. So what you want to do, you want to innovate to shift that relationship down, as suggested by the green curves here. And for example, sea-based closed or semi-closed aquaculture of post-smolt and harvest-ready salmon may be such a game-changing innovation, which I'm a bit excited about. Same with sea lice and its effect on the stock of wild salmonids. What we have seen is that as the biomass of salmon increases in a region, then the sea lice population also tends to increase. And with that, there's an increased pressure on stock of wild salmonids. And if it affects it significantly, then we can see a relationship like we see here on the right-hand side. Again, we want innovations to break that negative relationship. We want to shift the curve down so that we are able to sustain higher levels of wild salmonids as defined by society. If we look at the current regulation of inshore aquaculture, there are several elements. First of all, there's a production capacity regulation, the so-called maximum allowable biomass, MAB, and that biomass is regulated both at the farm, firm, and regional level. And the firms, they own this MAB, and it's also a collateral when they lend money, and it can be traded, it can be sold. Then we have a traffic light system that regulates growth in MAB at all three levels, and I will come back to that. When it comes to allocation of farm locations, that's primarily decided by the municipalities where the farms operate through their area plans and decisions that they make. But we also have the county involved as a coordinator where they collect assessments from different agencies. And then we have the monitoring and inspections on health, work environment, and safety. It's the Labor Inspection Authority. In production equipment and structures, it's the Directorate of Fisheries. When it comes to biology, it's the Norwegian Food Safety Authority. And when it comes to the marine environment, it's the county governor. So there are several agencies involved here, and I'll come back to that. I'll talk a little bit about the traffic light system. So the traffic light system is aimed at limiting the sea lice-induced mortality rate for wild salmonids. The Norwegian coast has been divided into 13 production areas, and in each production areas there are a number of farms. An assessment of sea lice-induced mortality is done in each production area, and that assessment determines the change in the salmon MAB in each production area. So these assessments are made through sampling on wild salmonids. It's made using models, and through these different approaches, it is determined whether it's a green traffic light, a yellow traffic light, or a red traffic light. And if it's a green traffic light, then the industry gets an offer to increase its maximum allowable biomass. If it's yellow, then they have to keep it constant. And if it's red, then they now have to reduce it by a percentage that is determined by the ministry in each round. And actually now, what we see now is that the traffic light system, the current status, is that we have 2 production areas in red, we have 2 in yellow, and the rest, 9 areas, are in green. So those 2 red areas have been forced to take down production. And I should mention that in one of these areas, the industry has challenged the government and gone to court because they think that the whole system is not precise enough. They question the relationship between salmon farming and the estimates of the sea lice-induced mortality on wild salmon. I think I'll skip this slide. I just mentioned it briefly when it came to the adjustment up or down of production related to the lights. So the government, they sell new biomass capacity. It's not given away for free. And in 2020, there was a new round based on these assessments and also individual farm performance, because that's another element. And the government auctioned off 27,000 metric tons of MAB with a total sales price, that is a government revenue, of $664 million. And the price per kilo of this MAB is pretty high. It's $24. And we, roughly speaking, per kilo of MAB, you may get 1.6 kilo of production. So you see that they have a pretty high estimate of the implied by that, the high profitability expectation on their MAB. So the question is, how do we increase salmon aquaculture production in a sustainable manner in the future? And we have seen that there has been stagnation in Norway. Do we do it in the coastal zone? Do we do it on land, or do we do it offshore? Do we use closed or open cages? Should we continue to produce the small smolt that we release into the sea, or do we need to produce larger smolt or post smolt to release into the growth cages to shorten the production period in the fjords, and thereby limiting the disease pressure and sea lice pressure in the fjords, or other innovations? So if we first take the issue of closed versus open cage aquaculture, and today it's 99% open cage aquaculture. What we see is that it has local environmental external effects, but the thing is that by some metrics, it's also the most productive food production technology that the world has ever seen in terms of feed conversion ratio, in terms of energy use, etc. Closed aquaculture provides a promise of smaller emissions to the environment, and then I think about sea lice, I think about organic matter, and about diseases. On the other hand, energy efficiency might be lower, or is lower, particularly on land. And we're going to learn a lot in the future about the actual performance of these closed technologies, whether they're on land and in the sea. When it comes to exposed ocean technology, then what we have available is vast new areas. Currently, we are just using the 10% of the ocean area in Norway that is inshore, and we're also just using a small fraction of that 10%. There is a 90% of the area is not used at all for aquaculture production. When we move offshore, then there's a large scale advantage, fairly partly related to the locations that will be fairly remote. There will be increased distance to neighbor farms, and that gives reduced biological risks. But then, of course, we have the harsh weather conditions and the long distance to land, which add both costs and risks. So there's a lot to learn here. And here you see some different concepts that are at different stages. So this is an example of exposed offshore production system that is operated by Salmon and built in China. So the Chinese, you get an idea how big it is when you see the Chinese here. So it has a height of 68 meters, diameter of 110 meters, can contain 1.5 million salmon. Investment cost only in the structure is $80 million approximately, and then you can add the investment in biological capital and so on. So it's a fairly big operation. The thing about salmon farming with the margins we see is that alternative technologies can enter the market even at significantly higher costs than we see in conventional salmon farming, and still they can survive in the market. So this is a way to explain it. We have a volume, market volume on the horizontal axis, and cost and price on the vertical axis. And then the blue supply curve, that is the conventional open cage supply, and we have a demand. And then these new alternative technologies, they might come in at a higher cost. So they will come in at a higher cost. And if the demand is low, then of course they will not be profitable and enter the market. But what we have seen over time is that demand has shifted outwards, and today you can sustain other technologies with higher costs. The government policies are a key to sustainable growth. But then we need a new organization of aquaculture regulation authorities. It's a question of the balancing of aquaculture policies, coastal open cage versus the coastal closed, versus the land-based, versus the offshore. And we need research and innovation policies to mitigate market failures. I even talked about that. This complex is a candidate for regulation. This is the aquaculture regulation complex in Norway, and unfortunately, it's in Norwegian here. But first, you see there are several layers here. There are ministries, there are several laws. So there are 6 ministries. There are like 8 or 9 laws. There are different government agencies, and there are regional government agencies involved here. And the challenge with this is that several agencies have a veto power. It's fairly complex and resource demanding regulations. Coordination between government agencies can be improved. Coordination between municipalities can be improved. So we often see slow and costly processes, and one may question the knowledge base of regulations especially at the local level. So if we look at the government license regime until now, the MAB licenses have been aimed at conventional open cage inshore farms, and offshore farms and closed or semi-closed farms, they struggle to compete in the market due to the pricing of the new MAB that I talked about. Then there's R&D licenses. They were evaluated last year, and it's a question to what degree those licenses satisfy the industry's need for new knowledge and for innovation. And then we had this temporary scheme of development licenses that gave very strong incentives to innovate in offshore technologies, closed technologies, but they were probably too generous compared to the high-priced conventional MAB licenses, because you got licenses, development licenses, for a fairly low price and on a permanent basis if you satisfy the criteria. We need a new regime in Norway, a more complete license regime that differentiate between research and innovation and commercial production, but also differentiate between onshore, open cages inshore, closed cages inshore, and offshore. And I'm not going, time does not allow me to go into detail on all of this, but today, basically what we have an onshore regulation regime that you see in the first row. We have a regime for open cages inshore, but we lack a regime for closed, semi-closed cages inshore and for offshore. And that is our great challenge, to develop those regulatory regimes and provide the right balances between these different production technologies when it comes to pricing of licenses and so on. We don't want to give a free lunch to some technologies, and we don't want to have overinvestments in technologies that are not sustainable and might not be sustainable. If we focus on regulation of inshore and offshore aquaculture, what we have now currently, as I've talked about, inshore, we have the MAB on production capacity, we have the municipalities and counties providing farm locations, and then we have these different agencies doing the monitoring and so on in different areas. In offshore, we can adopt some of these regulatory systems and principles. There will be some other authorities that will be involved in certain areas, but it's perfectly feasible to find a regime for offshore, and then we have to decide where do we differentiate between inshore and offshore. The nautical baseline is a natural starting point, a question is if we need to establish a buffer zone between inshore and offshore due to biosecurity concerns, and use the Directorate of Fisheries as a coordinating authority of offshore aquaculture. There's a number of interesting balancing issues, trade-offs when it comes to design of commercial offshore licenses. One is the safety and environmental biosecurity objectives. We need to ensure international competitiveness with other salmon producing countries. The license pricing should be commercially attractive and at the same time provide revenue to society. So to be commercially attractive, then you need to have a pricing that gives a positive net present value when you have realistic rate of return requirements, maybe in the range of 8 to 15%. It's about the duration of the licenses. They probably need to be fairly long or indefinite. They should be tradable. You should be able to sell and buy licenses. And that is also related to being able to use licenses as a collateral for loans. Offshore farms cannot compete with the current pricing of inshore maximum allowable biomass. So you cannot use the same price at the moment. When it comes to development of technology, we're still at an early stage. There are several criteria that should be taken into assessment. It's about sustainability, sustainable growth, both environmentally, economically, and socially. It's about technological diversity and uncertainty. We need to test different concepts and find out if they're sustainable and competitive. We need to increase the innovation speed. It's about the sharing of knowledge, increasing the knowledge about how the salmon actually is performing offshore. We know too little about that. And we need to account for market failure in R&D. These are large-scale investment projects, even when you do innovation. We're talking about investments in the order of, even for R&D projects, I would say it's investments in the order of $100 million US dollars plus. So we need a roadmap for offshore aquaculture. And the question is, what measures and regulation must be in place, and when should they be in place? And I think I've given some indications on what should be in place. And as I said, by mid-November, we are going to provide a report to the Minister of Fisheries, where we will address these issues that you see here about impact assessments, about aquaculture area blocks like you have in petroleum, about standards, about technology development, and post-smolt production capacity and coordination between different government agencies. So a very interesting exercise, a very challenging exercise, and I hope that we get our act together in Norway so that we can see some large-scale investments in Norway pretty soon. We are already seeing it, I would say. So this is the scenario towards 2050, where the scenario is total gross sales of 300 billion NOK. So again, you can take off a zero there to get the US dollar equivalent. And then that means investment in farm structures, logistics, etc. In onshore of maybe 40 billion NOK, closed sea-based farming 50 billion NOK, open sea-based farming 10 billion NOK, and offshore farming of 100 billion NOK. And on the left-hand side, you see a possible mix of production there, maybe with 2 million tons in open cage inshore farming, 1.5 in offshore farming, 1 million in closed and semi-closed sea-based farming, and then maybe 500,000 ton onshore. So very exciting development, a lot of challenges both for the industry and government, and it's going to be exciting to see how it plays out during the next couple of years. Thank you.
Thank you, Ragnar. We've had a couple of questions come through. So we'll do the first one, and then I will assign the questions to you in the question box so that you can answer them while our next speaker is talking. So the first question we had was from Sebastian Bell at the Maine Aquaculture Association. He asked if you thought that Norwegian salmon sector would have developed if they had to have the start, have they had to start under the current regulatory system that's in place.
And now you're talking about the regulatory system in Norway.
Correct.
Yeah, I think it would have developed. I mean, what has happened? I mean, if you look at the changes in sort of the recent 10 years, what we have seen is, I mean, one important factor has been the introduction of the traffic light system, the concern about sea lice. And the thing about sea lice was that was not an issue at all when we produced much less salmon. So they would not have met those limits that we have seen recently. So I would say that what we have seen is that as the industry has innovated and grown, the regulatory system has sort of accommodated to that development. So, and I think even if we had reintroduced that system now, maybe not if you go back to 1990, because there's a lot of technical requirements and so on that they would not have satisfied back then. But much of that regulatory structure they should have been able to satisfy. But as I said, you have to look at this as a co-evolution between innovation, production, and regulation in Norway.
Okay, thank you. So I have assigned some questions to you to answer while we have our next presenter. If you have trouble seeing those or anything, just send me a message in the chat box.